So welcome back to our Soma yoga practice. We're going to be starting on our feet this morning, and we're going to need, as usual, several props. We're going to be working on our pelvis relationship to our spine, to our spine, but also more so to our legs and our feet. So we're going to be needing a massage ball. If you don't have one of the small massage balls like we used in class, a tennis ball can work as well. And a blanket or two. It's always nice to have a couple of blankets around to support your body. A couple of yoga blocks, and if you don't have yoga blocks, sometimes a thick book can work. And I always have an extra little cushion around, so some throw cushions or pillows. And optional would be a chair if you need to for anything on your knees, or if you need assistance with balance. We're also going to be using the wall today, and a bolster if you have the round or square bolster. It's optional, so it's not necessary for today. All right, so we're going to start off coming to standing. I'm going to take my socks off for this, and we're just going to play with our posture a little bit here. So come to find mountain pose, or what we call Tadasana, where we stand with our feet about hip distance apart, and depending on how that feels. If you can bring your feet closer together and you find that you're still balanced, you can always do that as well. I like to kind of keep myself stacked under my hips. So initially what I'm going to have you play with is the position of your pelvis. So sometimes we might have a tendency for our pelvis to drift forward. So the further forward we have the pelvis drift, you can see if I kind of let things just hang out here and I drift my pelvis forward, I've kind of got myself into a little bit of a flatter low back, so the load through my spine isn't going to be as efficiently, it's not going to bear weight load through the spine as well. And as well as my pelvis being forward, I'm not going to be able to load well through my legs going down to support the body, or coming up from the ground. So just feel for your pelvis here and think about bringing the pelvis back a little bit so that it comes over a little bit more stacked over your heels. And notice if this feels more comfortable for you with the pelvis forward, or if the pelvis feels more comfortable in the posterior position where you're bringing it back a little bit. And just by bringing the pelvis back, you might notice some different changes in the curves of your spine as you bring it back. You might notice different load areas in your legs as well. So once you get into a position where your pelvis is a little more stacked over your heels and over your ankles, see if you can relax your quadriceps, so the thigh muscles. See if you can sort of relax your kneecaps, letting them soften. And then from there, we'll bring some awareness into noticing how your feet are coming into contact with the floor. So bringing specific awareness to just the soles of the feet. Noticing where you contact. Noticing if those contact points are different on either the right foot or the left foot. If you might have more tendency to bear a little more weight through the balls of the feet or the heels of the feet. And then the other thing when we're bringing awareness to the feet again is shift your pelvis forward again and feel how much more weight that puts onto the balls of the feet than if we bring the pelvis back and we balance out that weight transfer, or that load bearing through the feet a little bit. And then taking that awareness up through the legs, so noticing if there's any areas for you where you're gripping or bracing in the legs. It might be the buttocks, so if you can soften through the quads, the buttocks, maybe the hamstrings. And then sensing and feeling what's happening above the pelvis. So just noticing how the rest of your body's stacking up. If there's any tendencies for you to have rotation in your torso, where your pelvis might be going in one direction and your rib cage in the other, or you might be rotated slightly all the torso might rotate in one direction. There might be the sense of the torso being straight, but then we might have some rotation through the neck or the shoulders as well. So just noticing what's showing up. All right, and then from there, we're gonna take our massage ball, we're gonna roll out our hips before we do our first movement practice. So we're gonna take that massage ball. The idea is that we're gonna roll the side of the pelvis. I'm just gonna grab my pelvis model because we may have some new people that are haven't done this practice. So if you've already done it, I'm sure you've already started rolling your hips on the wall. So we take the ball and we're rolling this space on the side of the pelvis to about the hip socket. So it's about a space of about, what, 5 inches or so. So you take the side of your pelvis to the wall, and then we roll generally from side to side in this space. You can go up and down. We want to try to, it's not about excruciating pain. Where we have tension and tightness in our muscles, we can have tenderness, and but just stay on the inside edge of going into pain. So it's not about torture. And maybe while you're rolling the pelvis, you can check in with your breathing. So just starting to notice the pace of your breath, the depth of your breath. Noticing if there's any jaggedness to the breath or any breath holding. And then once you've explored some of the side of the hip here, we'll turn so that your buttocks face the wall, and then you have the ball. I'm on the right side of my pelvis, so I'm going to have the ball in the center of my right buttock. I'm going to try to avoid that sacrum, which is that triangle bone in the back of the pelvis. And then we're shifting your weight from side to side, rolling your pelvis out, or rolling that glute out. Taking it back and forth. So the glute, you can move higher and lower on the length of the buttock. Just finding sometimes we have some pretty ropey muscles here. You can bend your knees and roll up and down on the buttock as well. And again, once we've kind of explored that space, we'll take that all over to the opposite hip. So we'll go on to the outside of the opposite hip. So bringing the ball to the wall, and then again, it's usually a sideways movement here. Initially, you can go up and down as well. And just playing in that area, exploring what you find up near the top. That's called the iliac crest on the top of the pelvis. And as we get a bit lower, you're moving down towards, it's not actually, we can't actually get at the actual socket, but the muscles that hold the leg bone into the hip socket attach onto this point of the thigh bone that you feel. That's that hard bump that kind of sticks out on the side of the pelvis. And again, there might be some ropiness in there, some bumps. If you find a particular spot that's kind of interesting, you can hang out on it. Again, make sure that you're breathing, nice and even breath. And then once you've explored that side, then we rotate, so we turn the pelvis so the back faces the wall, and then again we roll the glute here. So what our rolling does is it brings some circulation into the tissues that we're working here. We do get what we call ischemic pressure, so we push down, it's like squeezing a garden hose. You squeeze it, and then when you let it go, so when the pressure releases off of the ball or where the ball is pressing, you get an influx of newly oxygenated blood into that space, so it helps flush out the muscles a little bit. You might be applying a little bit of stretch to the muscle fibers as well. But mostly what we use the rolling for is to really bring our awareness to these areas where we might be holding tension. Sometimes we're not even aware how tight an area is. All right, so once we've finished rolling that hip out, we're gonna just come down to our mat. We're gonna be going into legs up the wall. So I like to wear my socks when I do legs up the wall because my feet will slide a little bit better. And when you come into legs up the wall, the idea is that we do have our pelvis in a relatively neutral position. So we aren't completely flattened. Our low back, when we come into legs up the wall, our legs don't have to be at 90 degrees at our hips. We can have them a little bit further away so the spine will stay in neutral. If being in legs up the wall on your back absolutely doesn't work for you, you can do these practices with your legs also on the seat of a chair. We can do all the same work that we'll be doing in legs up the wall. Okay? If you need a blanket or anything under your head, that's always an option as well. Okay, so we're gonna bring yourself into that legs up the wall position. So noticing when you lay on your back, are you able to keep the spine in pretty much a neutral position, or the pelvis, so that there is a little bit of space under your lower back? And once you get into that position, we're just going to take a few moments to just settle in here. And bringing awareness to the weight of the pelvis and the weight of the spine into the floor. Bringing awareness to the breath here. So maybe noticing the breath into the belly and into the bowl of the pelvis. You might even consider breathing into the sides of your pelvis, into the sides of the hips. So imagining you can breathe in at the hips. And then on your next inhale, just gently start to tip your tailbone towards the mat. That's going to lift your low back away from the floor. So this we call our arch. And then let that slowly release. And you'll feel likely that when you take the tailbone towards the mat, there's a pull on the back of the legs. And then we repeat our somatics. When we're working in somatics, we generally repeat our movement about 2 or 3 times, consciously going into a contraction to bring the pelvis into that arch position, and then we slowly let it release. And then go in the opposite direction where you take the pubic bone and you roll it towards the navel. So the tailbone is tucking, the low back now will press into the mat, and then we slowly let it release. And then repeat that again 2 or 3 times. You might exhale as you flatten your low back. Inhale as you let it go. So these movements are exploratory in your body, so make sure you're moving in a comfortable range of motion. And then alternate between your arch. So the tailbone goes towards the mat. You slowly let it release. And then you roll the tailbone away from the mat into your flatten. Letting that go. And repeating that maybe 1 or 2 more times. once you've completed those movements, let yourself settle again. And then we're going to bring awareness to the ankles here. So we're going to start to flex your ankles, bringing your toes towards your nose. And that will put a lengthening sensation likely in the back of the calves, or maybe even all the way down to the sit bones. And then point your toes towards the sky. So the heels just move on the wall here as you point and flex the ankles 2 or 3 times. Gentle, easy movement, finding a comfortable range of motion. The next time you point your toes towards the sky, flatten the spine so the tailbone tucks away from the floor, pubic bone rolls towards the navel. So there will be a shortening on the back of the legs, and then slowly let that release. And then you bring your toes towards your nose as you move towards an arch on your back. So the low back lifts away from the floor as the tailbone moves towards the floor. And then alternate between those 2 movements again. So point the toes, flatten the back. Flex the ankles so that the toes come to the nose as you move towards your arch. Investigating that relationship between the ankles and the back of the legs and the pelvis. And then once again, once you've repeated it 2 or 3 times, we take a little pause. Bring your hands down onto your pelvis here while you're waiting and letting your body rest. We're going to bring the thumbs into your hip creases and wrap your fingers around the sides of your pelvis so that you're feeling your leg bones resting into your hip sockets. From there, we're going to start to rotate the thighs out. So both of your legs are going to roll into what we call external rotation. The thighs roll out, that turns the knees out, and it turns the toes out. And then we bring them back towards center and rolling them in towards each other. You might have to kind of cross your feet over each other and then slowly let that go. So this movement that we're going through is external and internal rotation of the leg in our hip socket. As we're rotating the legs, we want to try not to lead with the foot. So we think about rotating our hip rather than the foot. The foot just comes along for the ride, and our pelvis should be just staying nice and quiet. The next time you have your thighs rolled out to the sides, towards the sides in that external rotation, you're going to bend your knees, and we let the heels slide down the wall only as far as your hips move. So, which means that sometimes we might have more range for our knees to bend than our hips. We want the pelvis to stay still, and then we take the legs back up the wall. Rotate them open so they're in external rotation. Slide the heels down the wall, it'll be opening up your inner thighs a little bit, but we want the pelvis to just remain quiet on the floor, and then you can slide the legs back up. Rotate into external rotation, and then slide down. Slide back up, and then your legs can come back to center. And take that through maybe 1 or 2 more times after my explanations. Nice easiness in the torso. The legs are doing all the efforting here. And then we're just going to take the legs a little bit wider so that it gives you a little more space. Rotate your thighs in so the toes and the knees will roll towards each other. Then you're going to bend your knees. Chances are your knees are going to come together, and then you can push the legs back up the wall. And then bend them down again and take them up. So if your legs go back to neutral when you go up, you need to rotate them back into internal rotation. and then we bring them down the wall a little bit, and then back up. Generally, the range when we go into internal rotation and we bend the knees is lesser than when we're in external rotation. Play with that one more time. And then when you come back to center, we're going to play with what we call ski legs here today. So we're going to rotate the legs into the same direction. So the right leg is going to roll into external, so your right toes point to the right. Your left thigh rolls in so that the left toes also point to the right. Now this time when we bend the knees, you're going to start to feel the left side of your pelvis move away from the floor a little bit. So it starts to twist the pelvis a little bit. Then bring your knees to center and then slide them up the wall. Rotate the legs to the left. Slide your heels down. The pelvis will pull away from the floor on the right side. And back to center and slide your heels up the wall. Rotate to the right. Slide your heels down. The left side of the pelvis pulls away. Roll back to center and then press them up. So this is a combining movement of pelvis, legs, and spine. Coming back to center and then rolling or pressing yourself up. And then we're going to go from there. We're going to bring our knees in towards our belly. And if it feels comfortable for you to hug your knees in towards your belly, feel free to hug the knees in, maybe bringing your nose up towards your knees. And if that doesn't feel comfortable, you don't have to go there. And then from there, going to roll over onto your side and press yourself up out of that legs up the wall position. And then we're going to scoot onto our side. So when we go onto our side, we're going to have a blanket and a cushion for your head, or you might use the yoga blocks to support your head. When we come onto that side lying position, the blanket is under your ribs. There's a space for your shoulder to come to the floor, and then your head is supported by the cushion. And when you come down, your joints should be stacked. So your shoulders are stacked on top of each other. Your bottom arm just lays out on the mat. And then your knees and your hips are generally at about 90-degree angles here. We're just going to be looking at the pelvis rather than doing the full side curl movement this morning. So the leg position isn't, we don't have to be as particular. Whatever the position you find yourself in, we want to make sure that you're resting here in comfort. And then we're going to revisit that arch and flatten we just did on the wall. So on your side, we're going to take the tailbone towards the back of the mat. That's going to create this arch in your lower back. If it feels available to you, you could bring your upper back into it a little bit. Think about your head would kind of be sliding back a little bit on your cushion, and then slowly let that release. When we go in the opposite direction, we curl so the abdominal muscles contract. We pull the pubic bone towards the navel. We might even think about curling the ribs down towards the pubic bone. So doing a flatten in this side lying position. And then we let the muscles release on the front of the body, bringing ourselves back to neutral. Try that arch again. Tailbone goes towards the back of the mat. And you might be bringing your upper body into that extension a little bit. Slowly let it release. And then going into the flatten on the front of the body. So in the side lying position, you can get a little more range of motion of the spine. And then we let it release, letting it go completely. From there, go ahead and bring your hand onto the very top of your pelvis and feel for those muscles in our waist. So these guys are the muscles that we often can lose motor control of because we just forget how to use them. So we're going to start to feel for that ridge of bone and start to think about bringing that ridge of bone, the pelvis, up towards the ribs. So this is breaking that side curl movement down, and we slowly let the pelvis release back down. So the idea is the muscles in the waist shorten on the left side, and then we slowly let that go. It's important to try to really bring awareness to when we hike the pelvis. Is it your pattern to go into a tuck or an extension, so an arch or a flatten? Or are you able to execute that movement almost like you're between two panes of glass and you can't bring the pelvis into that flatten or the arch? And maybe take that through one more time on this side movement, and then we slowly let it release. From there, we're going to move the pelvis forward and back on this left side. So we're moving towards a rotation. So we're going to let the left side of the pelvis roll forward towards the floor in front of you, and the top leg will just glide on the bottom leg, and then we slowly let that release. So sometimes if this is the first time you're trying to do this, I'll see people really try to use their leg to pull their pelvis around. Just let your leg rest on the bottom leg and find the movement from the waist, so the pelvis rolls forward, and then we bring it back into neutral. Generally, when we're doing that movement, the rib cage is going to stay quiet here, so we're not rolling right over with the whole torso. We're trying to differentiate pieces here, the pelvis from the rib cage. Just play with that forward movement. And you'll notice that as you roll the pelvis forward, your top knee will glide forward on that bottom knee. And then we bring ourselves back into neutral. And then we start to roll the pelvis back towards the back of the mat, and then that top leg gets dragged on the bottom leg, and then we come back to neutral. So again, the pelvis relatively is moving while the rib cage is staying nice and quiet. And then try that one a few times. Moving the pelvis back is often more difficult for people to find than the forward movement, but it can always be different for everybody's different. Our patterns of movement are different in each body. Alright, so once you've kind of explored that movement, then play back and forth towards the front of the mat and towards the back of the mat. Taking it 2 or 3 times. And then when you settle into neutral there, for this one we do have to lift the leg off the bottom leg a little bit. I'm going to invite you to keep the knee in a bent position. Take your top leg just away from the bottom leg so it's about hip height, and then bring your hand onto your pelvis. So it's important that we want to feel what pieces are moving here. As you take your left leg or the top leg back towards the back of the mat, we want not the spine to arch. So we want to keep the pelvis and the spine quiet as we move the leg back towards, this is called hip extension. And then as you bring your knee forward towards your belly, we want our pelvis to remain in that neutral position as well. Some things that happen is we might drop the leg down, so keep that leg up at about hip height as we gently move the leg into hip flexion coming forward and hip extension bringing the leg back. If it's our habit to not move from our hip socket, we do all this movement from our lower back, which isn't a healthy movement pattern. So we want to try to break it down so that we can find the movement in the hip socket, forward into flexion, and backwards into extension. So your spine shouldn't be moving here, your pelvis shouldn't be moving, it's just that leg moving forward and back. All right, and then when you're complete with that, we're gonna flip over to the other side. So you might just roll over onto your other side, or you might flip ends so you can also look at the screen that you're watching. And again, set yourself up so that you're stacked up on your rib cages on a blanket, and then the shoulders can stack on top of each other, and your hips are stacked, your knees and your ankles are stacked. And then once we get into that position, we're going to bring our hand onto the top of the pelvis. So it might be helpful here just to go through that arch and flatten one more time. So we take the tailbone towards the back of the mat, and as you do that, again, you might bring your upper body into that arch as well. So the spine is in extension, and then we slowly let it release. And then we contract the abdominal muscles to flatten and move the spine into that rounded position. You might bring your ribs down into that almost like a curl, and then slowly letting it go. I'm just playing 1 or 2 times here. We already did this movement when we were on the other side. Anytime you move your pelvis, you're affecting both sides of your body, because a pelvis is one structure. Well, it's lots of pieces that are brought together in one structure. All right, and then once you're complete with those arch and flattens, you're going to bring that right side of the pelvis now up towards your rib cage. So this is the basics of that hip hike, trying to find those muscles in your waist that bring the pelvis up. So sometimes they can be really tricky to find. And even though we've done sometimes these movements many, many times, still try to bring your awareness to, are you able to actually do that movement in this, what we call plane of motion? So we're not tucking the tail, we're not arching, we're not flattening, we're not rolling forward, we're just hip hiking. A lot of us might have a tendency to want to use that leg. In the side curl we do that. But a lot of us will use the hip flexor to try to hike that hip, so we want to keep that leg quiet. All right, and then we're going to play with that forward and back movement of the pelvis again. So we're rolling the pelvis forward, the top leg just glides on the bottom leg, and then we bring the pelvis back to neutral, and then we repeat that again, maybe 3 or 4 times. The rib cage generally stays nice and quiet here, so we're not rolling the whole torso forward. And then once you've played with the forward movement, try to find the backward movement, so the back side of the pelvis rolls towards the back of the mat, and then we come forward, and then we roll it back again, coming back to neutral. You'll notice probably the top leg is following along, so try to keep that leg as relaxed as possible. These outer hip muscles don't really have to do anything for this. As we then start to move into the forward movement and rolling the pelvis back. Taking it through a few times, seeing if we can differentiate the pelvis from the ribs. And then again, once we've completed with that, we're going to lift the top leg away from the bottom leg. And again, you're wanting to sense and feel here, as we take that leg back into hip extension, that we're not arching through our back. So our pelvis is staying in the same position as we take the leg back. And then we bring that leg forward into hip flexion. The spine should not round, the pelvis stays nice and quiet, and then we take it back and forth. Really paying attention to the position of the pelvis and the spine as we move the Try to avoid letting that leg, it's heavy. So sometimes that leg will drop towards the floor. I'm going to try to keep it in neutral at hip height. And finish off with that last one. And then letting your leg just rest down on the bottom leg. Taking a breath or two there. And then from our side lying position, we're going to transition over onto our hands and knees. So if being on your hands and knees doesn't work for you, you can use a chair to support the upper body. So if you are on your hands and knees, you're going to be, you could use a blanket under your knees as well to support the knees when we go into our lunge position as well. But if you do need to use a chair, you can have the chair as your base of support for your hands, and then your feet are on the floor. So we can do all the movements that we would be doing on the floor here with our chair. So we're going to just go through those little arch and flattens again, moving the pelvis on the leg bones. So this is commonly called our cat and cow. So as we tuck the tailbone, we're going to round the spine all the way up the spine. The head will drop, and then we let that release. And then we take the tailbone towards the sky, rolling up through the spine into our extension. And then tucking the tail, rolling the spine, and taking that through maybe one or two more times. And then once you find that neutral position, we're going to take our right foot and we're going to reach it back so that you can curl your toes under. So either way, if you're on your hands and knees or if you're using a chair, you can bring the ball of the foot to the floor, and then you're going to press through your heel. If you're using the chair, you're going to think about pressing the heel to the floor and reaching the crown of the head away. So you're going to be getting a calf stretch here. So if you're on the floor and you're on your hands and knees, you're taking that heel back and you're pressing out through the heel, and you're thinking about reaching the crown of the head forward. And then you can flex. I ran out of map here. You can flex and point the ankle again here, so you get a nice calf stretch. We're activating the calf when we press the ball of the foot into the floor. That's activating the muscles on the back of the leg, and then we press them into a little bit of a stretch. Taking that through one or two more times. And then we bring that knee in and take your back foot, the opposite foot towards the back of the mat. And then again, we find that calf stretch, push the ball of the foot into the mat, and then we press forward, and then you press your heel away. So again, if you're using a chair, you've got your left leg back, you press into the floor to push up, and then you press your heel back and down, pressing up, and then pressing down. And a couple more times. All right, then you're either on hands and knees or using the chair. We're going to go in towards our lunge position. So we're going to take our right foot back. Our left foot will be stepped forward, and our right foot is back. And then if you're on the floor, if your hands are on the floor, you could also use your blocks here to give you a little bit of extra height. I'm going to try to demo this with both variations. But you could be using your blocks here. You have your back leg back, and you're in a low, you could be in a high lunge. If you feel comfortable in a high lunge, you could be here, or you could be just in a low lunge with the knee on the floor. Either way, we're going to be trying to bring the pelvis back and forth, so depending on which one you're in. Generally, our spine is going to stay in neutral here. So there's not arching and flattening happening in the back. We're just going back and forth with our hips and our knees here. So again, if you're on your chair, you're just doing a forward and backward movement. So the one thing, the higher you go, the more tendency might be to twist the pelvis around as we go forward and back. So think about your pelvis facing straight ahead with these movements. All right, and then we're going to take it to the other side. So you're either in a high lunge or a low lunge, and then we're bringing the pelvis forward and back. So you might be getting some hamstring lengthening on the front leg. As you go back, you get the hip flexor lengthening as you go forward. And again, you can be in a high lunge or a low lunge in any of these positions. Find out what suits your body the best. And if you're watching the recording, you can always pause and spend a little more time playing with these movements. All right, and then from there, we're going to come up to standing. So whatever way makes sense for you to come up to standing, we'll make our way up onto our mat, or onto our feet again. So once we get up onto our feet, I want you to just take a moment again to kind of check in with how you're stacking up on your feet. Notice if there's maybe an easier ability to bring the pelvis to rest in more of a neutral position. If we've kind of shifted away from that forward position, if that's yours, and if that's your default pattern. Can you be here with the legs relaxed, noticing the weight of the legs into the feet, or the how we bear weight through the feet, noticing if there's any shifts or changes there. And then from there, we're going to do a tiny little movement that's called our pelvic listing, which we've practiced in previous sessions. So what that movement is that we're moving the pelvis on the leg bone. So if I think of my bolster here as my leg and my pelvis on one side, I'm bringing my pelvis down onto my leg bone so that we're going to access our muscles in our outer hip. So how we do that, if I'm looking at my right side of my pelvis, I'm going to think about my breastbone staying relatively in the center here. So I'm not leaning, not doing a side bend. I'm going to just try to lift my left foot off the floor slightly and then bring it back down. So if you think about when we take a step forward, what has to happen with the pelvis is this little listing movement. Otherwise, we'd not be clearing the floor. So we want to think about being able to list. The pelvis slides down slightly on that one side, and then we bring it back to neutral, bringing it into that little movement. So it's not a very big movement as we lift and lower the opposite foot. So there's not a lot of activity in our waist here. The strength of this comes from the side of the pelvis that the foot is attached to the floor. And then we can check it out on the other side. Pressing the pelvis down, that's going to lift that right foot slightly, and then we bring it down. So you can practice this just on the floor, or you could practice this with your foot also on a block. So we'll go there next. So we're going to stand with one foot on the block. So let's go back to that right foot, bringing the right foot onto your block, and then bring the left foot up onto the ball of the foot. So we're keeping our pelvis level here. And then we're going to take the lifting action here onto the right side of the pelvis so that that foot's cleared the floor. And if you need your balance work here, if you need a chair or the wall, that's always an option to stand close by. So once you have that foot off the floor, Then we're going to bring that leg forward into hip flexion and then back into hip extension. So we're mimicking what we did when we were lying on our side. So we're standing, we're listing, pelvis remains in neutral here, and then we're going to bring that knee forward into flexion and then bringing the hip back into extension. It's your choice. If you have the leg extended, you could bring it up full and with it, fully lengthened here into hip flexion and hip extension. Either way, we want the pelvis to remain in neutral, the spine in neutral. So we're not arching or flattening, we're just moving that leg forward and back. And then we come down. So hopefully when you're listing and you're moving that left leg while you're standing on that block, you're going to be starting to be really aware of that right hip. So those muscles in the right side of the pelvis are working hard to keep us in that neutral position. Then we step that left foot on the block, come up, so you're on the toes or on the ball of the foot of the right foot. We list slightly towards the left so that the right foot can clear the floor. And then again, our pelvis and spine stay in neutral as we lift the knee towards the belly, and then we move the leg into hip extension. Bringing the leg forward and bringing the leg back. Taking that through two or three more times. Neutral position in the spine and pelvis. Again, you can have the legs straight or you can have it bent. The action is the same at your hip. And then when you're complete with that, come on off of your block and come back into Tadasana, and then we're going to take this into a couple of yoga postures as well. So we're going to come into tree pose first, and I have to do this sideways on my mat, otherwise I'm going to hit the wall. Maybe I'll go on a diagonal. So the idea is that we're standing in Tadasana. I'm going to have you shift your weight into the left foot. So we're going to list on the left side of the pelvis. We still keep the torso upright here, so we're letting the left side of the pelvis pull down slightly. That foot can come off the floor. Start to bend your right knee. Watch your pelvis stays in neutral. Rotate your thigh open. So when we rotate the thigh open, the pelvis is still facing forward. And then you can put your foot on your calf, or you might even have it down near your ankle. Find what works for you, or you can stand staying steady here. One of the key things to think about is watching that you're not letting that left hip pop out. We want to think about this is that listing action. And then from that tree pose, keeping the pelvis in neutral, we're going to take our right leg and step it back behind us, coming into a nice easy warrior one here. So the foot doesn't have to be in line with your back foot. I generally keep my feet about hip distance apart in a warrior one. And we want to keep our left knee stacked over our left ankle. Spine is in neutral, so I might be able to turn forward here. So one of the things with our warrior poses when we're working with our front leg is we want to make sure that our knee is stacked over the ankle. The knee hasn't fallen in towards the midline. You want to keep it in line with your hip socket. Your pelvis is facing forward, so we don't have the pelvis going off to the side. And then find that easy balance there. And then from there, we'll take our arms out to our sides, bringing the arms up as high as you comfortably can. If that's painful for your lower back or your shoulders, you can always keep the arms at a lower height, or you can keep the arms out of it altogether. You could bring the arms to shoulder distance apart. You might bring the hands together, clasping, and bringing the index fingers to point towards the sky in what we call a Shiva Mudra pose. And then from that warrior one pose, what we do is we lift our back heel. We're going to now take our pelvis and rotate it open. So we're taking the legs actually going into external rotation, but I'm not moving my left leg. I'm just moving my pelvis on that left leg, and then I let my foot rest back onto the floor. So I'm going to show it from a couple of angles here. So we start off from our warrior one, lift the back heel, rotating the pelvis, whoops, balance 101, rotating the pelvis on that leg bone as we open up the pelvis to the side of the mat. So the tendency here is often that that left leg will follow us into that movement. So go only as far with your pelvis as you can keep that leg pointing towards the front of the mat. And then when we complete it, your back leg is in internal rotation and your left leg, which is the front leg, is in that external rotation. From there, we're going to add a little rotation of our torso here. So we bring the rib cage to face the side of the mat. Again, when you bring the rib cage to face the side of the mat, watch that you don't drop that left knee in towards the midline. It still should be pointing forward as we add that rotation. And then you can bring your arms out to your sides. Your gaze is out over the middle finger of your left hand. And again, we can just pause in stillness. Breathe. Think of connecting down to the feet. Equal weight, front foot and back foot. And then to come out of this, we're going to straighten the left leg, lift the ball of that left foot, rotate your leg to come back to center. So both legs are generally pointing towards the side of your mat. Soften your knees here, and then we're going to step the feet back together. And then we're going to take that through the opposite side. So you're standing in Tadasana or mountain pose. We bring the weight a little bit more into that right foot. So we're going to be listing on our pelvis and then bending your left knee, keeping the spine in neutral, rotating the leg out. So as we turn the leg out, the pelvis doesn't go with it. And then we bring the sole of the foot maybe onto the calf, or maybe it's down by your foot if you're struggling with balance. And then we want to try not to let that hip pop out. So we're thinking about that movement of pulling the pelvis down on that leg bone. And then again, from our tree, we're going to take the left leg and step it back behind us without rotating the pelvis. So we want to keep the torso square towards the front of your mat as we find our warrior one. So the knee is pointing straight forward. Your back foot might be slightly externally rotated, but we want to make sure that those hip bones are pointing forward. And check in that there's no strain through the back of the pelvis and the back of the, or into the lower back here. If you're finding any strain, you just make little adjustments, step that back foot forward. You might take a little rotation out of your pelvis, if your pelvis rotated in. And then from there, we bring the arms into our pose, finding the one position that works the best for you. And so the arms might be in cactus. They might be all the way up into Shiva Mudra. And then pausing here for a few breaths. Focusing on the steadiness here. Finding balance. Equal weight, front foot and back foot. Left foot to right foot. Nice easy breath. And then from our warrior one, we're going to take it into that warrior two. So we think about this point of our pivoting happening here in our right hip. So we lift the back heel, which is the left foot. We start to open the pelvis to the left, spinning on the ball of that back foot. Watch that this right knee doesn't fall or collapse in. We want to keep that, what we call this power line from hip to knee to ankle, and we open up the pelvis a little bit towards that right side of your mat. So chances are the pelvis isn't quite pointing fully towards the side of the mat. So we're going to leave the pelvis where it is, and we're going to rotate the upper part of the torso towards the side of the mat. And then we take our arms out to our sides into that warrior two. Your gaze is out over the middle finger of the right hand. I'm just going to change my orientation on my mat here. Again, equal weight is balanced into both feet, front and back. Nice, easy breath. And then again, to come out of our warrior pose, you can bring your hands down if you like to your pelvis. We're going to straighten the right leg, lift the ball of the right foot, rotate on the heel as you turn that leg back to center, and then we can soften those knees, and then we step back into Tadasana again. All right, so from our Tadasana, again, we'll just check out where you are standing, and it's kind of interesting. Generally at the start of the practice, I was a little more comfortable with my feet a little bit wider, and then after this practice, bringing my feet a little closer together, I find that my balance is just as good, or maybe even better, with my feet a little closer. So some little changes that happen. And then coming back to checking in with the soles of the feet, noticing how you're bearing weight again through the feet. I'm noticing much more tendency to have a lot more weight into my heels. So if I were to stand sideways, chances are my pelvis is back over my heels rather than drifting out here, where this sometimes if I'm tired or fatigued or not very stable in my hips, that's where my pelvis goes. So it's just getting into those legs and playing with that relationship makes big little changes. So. All right, and then from there, we're going to make our way back down to the mat. Or down to the floor, I should say. So you could come to the front of your mat. We might take the arms up as we inhale, going into maybe a little bit of extension if that feels comfortable for you. And then as you exhale, hinging forward, letting the pelvis tip on the leg bones. You can soften the knees, keeping the spine long as you can. And then eventually the spine is going to start to round down over your thighs, bringing yourself into a forward fold, letting the weight of the head drop down. So you could be here, you could have your hands on your knees. Find the position that works best for you, where you are comfortable. There's no strain in my classes, please. There's effort, but no strain. And then once you've come to that forward fold, we're going to step it back. So we're going to go on hands and knees, or if hands and knees doesn't work for you, then you come onto your back and you bring your knees in towards your belly. Coming to hands and knees, we're going to draw the hips back towards the heels to move towards a child's pose, letting the torso round over your thighs and letting your forehead come towards the floor. You might stack your hands underneath your forehead, finding the position that works best for you. If you like to bring your hands back to your sides, you could also do that. But if the head's just hanging there, it's not very restful. So you might want to have the hands underneath the forehead. And just hanging out here for a few breaths. And if you are on your back, you're just bringing your knees in towards your belly, finding a nice, comfortable stretch for your back. And then when you're ready to move and transition again here, go ahead and make your way onto your back if you're not already there. Once you come down onto your back, we're going to bring the right knee in towards the belly. You can lengthen the left leg out towards the end of the mat. Hang out with that right knee drawn in for a few breaths. Go ahead and take the right knee and bring it across your torso, and then the right arm reaches out to your side. We come into our twist, so bring the right side of the pelvis away from the floor. Coming into that twist only as far as your right shoulder stays on the floor. So if you're coming in and your shoulder's really lifting away, just back it out a little bit so that the shoulder blade stays nicely attached to the floor. You might turn your head to look towards the right, so we bring that twist into the whole spine. And then go ahead and come on back out, bringing the right foot to the floor, left knee comes in towards the belly, right leg is extended. And again, just take a pause with that left knee drawn in. And then we take the left leg across the torso, and then we find the waist muscles here to bring that twist into the spine. You can take the head and turn it towards the left. The left arm is reaching out. And again, go only as far into that twist as your left shoulder stays on the floor. And again, just pausing for a few breaths. And then from there, we come back to center. And we're going to grab our bolster if you have a bolster. If you don't have a bolster, you could use a couple of blocks here to support your thighs. You could use a couple of rolled blankets. We're going to be transitioning into our relaxation here. So bring yourself into comfort and warmth. So I'll just demo if you don't have the bolster. You'll be bringing your soles of your feet together, letting your blocks support your thighs. So if you don't have blocks, you could use throw pillows or rolled blankets here. So this is a reclined bound angle pose, and the idea is that we're allowing our legs just to be supported and rested. If you're using a bolster, it's the same idea. You just have your bolster under your knees. The soles of your feet come together, and then the bolster supports your legs. And you come into your rest on your back. You might cover up with a blanket, just making sure that you're comfortable. And I'm just going to guide you through about 10 minutes or so of a relaxation here. So you might even like, once you get settled, to bring your hands onto your pelvis. I'll give you a few more minutes to get yourselves all settled. That was a lot to throw out at you in positioning. So making sure that you are comfortable here. So if you haven't already done so, go ahead and bring your hands onto your pelvis, letting them just settle around the hip sockets into the belly. And just check in with the expansion of the breath as you breathe in, feeling the belly expand here. And as you breathe out, the belly just drops back towards the spine. The space that we're focusing on is our sacral plexus, which is about 2 inches below the belly button. If You can just think of a source of energy here in the sacral plexus. With each breath expanding a little bit more, letting the tissues of the belly and the hips soften to receive the breath. So the buttocks relax, the low back, the abdominal muscles, the sides of the hips. Visualize the breath and the energy expanding from the sacral plexus outwards to the hips. Letting that energy and breath expand and radiate downwards into the thighs. Feeling the weight of the pelvis and the legs starting to let go into the support of the floor, the blocks or the bolsters. Letting the breath and the energy of the sacral plexus, sacral chakra, expand downwards into the knees. Into the lower legs. Letting the weight of the legs completely surrender to the floor or your supports. All the way down to the ankles. And into the feet, the tops of the feet and the soles of the feet. Again, letting the weight of the pelvis and the legs completely surrendering into the floor and into your supports. And with the legs and the pelvis weight into the floor, focus on your breath again in the belly. Feel how there's also expansion upwards towards the ribs. To the sides of the waist. And maybe even into your lower back. Letting the breath and the energy from the sacral plexus start to expand upwards to engulf the rib cage, full belly, waist and low back. Really feel the weight of the rib cage letting go into the floor. The full length of the spine, softening through the shoulders that live on the rib cage. And when you let go of the shoulders, feel the arms soften into the floor. Softening through your jaw, letting the breath expand all the way up through the neck, to the jaw, the base of the skull. Continuing upwards, softening the eyes. Letting the eyeballs sink into their sockets. And feeling the weight of the head surrender to the floor. The shoulders, the arms, the spine and the rib cage. The pelvis and the legs. Taking a few more breaths here as you continue to rest. And letting your breath deepen just a little. Take a nice deep breath in. Letting the awareness move also to your fingers and your toes. Just starting to slowly wiggle the fingers and the toes here. Maybe starting to move through your wrists and your ankles. Moving in through the knees and the hips by bringing the knees together. Rolling your bolsters or your cushions out of the way, moving the arms and the legs, and coming back up to the spine. And then roll onto your side, either the right or the left side, and just take a moment to pause on your side for a few breaths. And then slowly making your way up from that sideline position to just come either into a seated position, or you may come back up onto your feet if sitting on the floor isn't comfortable for you. And once you've transitioned, make sure that you've found a place of comfort. So you might like to place a cushion under the pelvis if you're sitting on the floor, and if you're standing, just making sure that you're at ease. And then just taking this last moment to just an overall check-in with your whole well-being, sensations in the physical body, noticing maybe what has shifted and changed as a result of your practice on the mat this morning. And then on an inhale, go ahead and reach the arms up to the sky. And as you exhale, go ahead and draw the hands down to the heart, letting your thumbs connect to the center of the breastbone, taking a moment here to express gratitude. So expressing gratitude to yourself for taking the time for our practice today, and expressing your gratitude to our community of like-minded people that have joined us in our practice this morning, and as well to our global community. Thank you for joining me for this practice. Namaste. All right, thank you, and we'll see you next week. Have a great week.